welcome to episode 27 of Roll, Play, Grow, the podcast for tabletop entrepreneurs, creators, and fans. I am Courtney Stover of Lightheart Adventures, and in this podcast, we talk to the creators behind the brands and the tabletop roleplay gaming space about who they are and how they are turning their passion for gaming into a career. How many fans of Grimm's fairy tales are listening to this show right now? Krista Martocci is an author and game designer publishing D&D adventures set in her own homebrew Grimm-themed world. She currently has 2 adventures based on Snow White and Bremen town musicians, as well as several subclass supplements out on DriveThruRPG and available in a couple local bookstores. We talk about how she went from creating a one-shot for her friends to redesigning it and getting it ready for publication, selling her adventures in a physical bookstore, and how she taught herself all of the skills needed to get an adventure ready for publication all by herself. Before we dive into the interview, if this is your first time tuning into the show, welcome! This podcast is a part of Lightheart Adventures, which is a small company I co-founded with my husband. We offer a weekly blog on our website where you'll find tips for running games, free monthly one-shot adventures, product reviews, and more. You'll find that blog at lightheartadventures.com. Brenton also creates beautiful dungeon maps, both on DM's Guild and on a commission basis. Some other ways you can support us and this show are by checking out our Patreon, subscribing to the show, leaving a review, and checking out our affiliate links. The affiliate I'm going to highlight today is the creator behind some of our favorite dice in a variety of materials, including wood, metal, stone, and resin. They currently have a really fun pumpkin-themed dice set, which I, as a very basic white girl, love. It is orange and gold and very shiny. But whatever dice you like, you can go to diceenvy.com and enter code LIGHTHEARTADV to get 10% off your order, get some snazzy dice, and help keep this show running. That is all for now, so please sit back and enjoy this conversation with Krista. We are chatting with Krista Martocci today, the author and game designer behind Cattail Press. How are you today, Krista?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Of course. I'm excited to learn all about your fairy tale inspired adventures.
All right. Well, I've written a couple.
Awesome. Just to start things off, can you tell us a bit about who you are and how you got into gaming?
Yeah, sure. I'm Krista. I actually work as a data engineer, so I'm kind of a nerd already by career. But I did have a stint in theater for a long time, and then I did do some astronomy. So I think all of my background has rolled up into my personality a little bit. And so I think applying it to role-playing games is a really good way to apply a lot of skills that I've learned in the past. I got into gaming because I really liked board games for most of my life. So I spent a lot of time playing those. But then my friend Liam, who I was, often doing game nights with, was like, oh, I want to start a D&D campaign. And I had always thought of, and this wasn't that many years ago, so I had always thought of D&D and magic on one side of the line and board games on the other. And I was just never going to cross it. I was like, that might be too much. That's too nerdy, right? But then, I agreed. It was fine. I was like, yeah, I'll try it out. And this was 3 or 4 years ago only. And turns out I really like playing Dungeons and Dragons. And then another friend of mine started another campaign. And so I'm still playing with those 2 groups 3 or 4 years later. And we play weekly. And then as far as getting into writing, it was only 2 Christmases ago. I was home and I had 2 weeks off. So I had really nothing to do. I had planned on doing nothing. And I was watching Critical Role's Christmas one shot that Liam O'Brien hosted and our DM'd, and he did Santa's elves as the characters and did a whole Nightmare Before Christmas themed Christmas story, and I thought that was really interesting to turn very non RPG things like Santa's elves into a Dungeons and Dragons story. I just thought that I had never really thought about it like that. It had always been like, these are Dungeons and Dragons things and they belong in RPGs, and like putting in something that wasn't Dungeons and Dragons into a role-playing game just was really interesting. So then the very next day was Christmas Eve, and I went to this, I was like, I'm going to write a one shot because this was such a fun like session that I watched. And so I thought it would be neat to turn in the dwarves from Snow White into the players of a mini adventure or a one shot. So I was like, I'm going to write a one shot for my friends. And so I went to the store, bought myself a DM's guide, and talked to the lady at 20 Sided Store in Brooklyn for like an hour. And she's totally like, yes, you should do this. This is a thing everyone should do if they want to. And so that Christmas break, I just like started outlining a one shot. It was never going to go past that. It was just going to be like, I will play with my friends, and that's all we're going to do. And then that will be the end of it. So we did that. And then, 3 months later, there was a pandemic. Yay, surprise. And so I think once I got through like the initial shock of the pandemic, and then the first summer where, you know, you still had a little bit of freedom to like roam around while it was warm out again. Once we went into that winter time and I was stuck inside for most of it. I decided to just take that one shot. After talking to the guy who originally introduced me to Dungeons and Dragons, he's like, yeah, you could publish that. And after we played it with that group too. And so I then did all the research over Thanksgiving break, and then continued over Christmas break to like actually turn it into a publishable thing. But I had to redo a lot of it so that I didn't get sued by Wizards of the Coast. There was a lot of like legal research and like learning how to use the open gaming license, and then like making it all Grimmified. So a lot of it got rewritten from the original version. So that's a very long version of how I got where I am.
And that's great. There's so many follow-up questions and things I want to dig into in this story. Yeah. The first thing is that I 100% relate with you on like, oh yeah, I'm a nerd, but I'm not that nerdy.
Yeah.
When I explain how I got into things too, I'm like, well, yeah, I grew up with sci-fi and reading all sorts of fantasy books and playing video games and watching like basically the Sci-Fi Channel every Friday night with Dad. But you know, I wasn't that nerdy. And then I met Britton. But yeah, so totally with you on that. But
I didn't even grow up with as much fantasy as one would think, because fantasy wasn't in the 80s and 90s, like fantasy hadn't taken over. So like now all the top movies tend to be fantasy or comic book driven these days. A lot. Mm-hmm. And back in the 80s and 90s, that wasn't necessarily the case. So I think it was most of my adventure writing that I do now, and like the reason I picked Grimm fairy tales is because I tend to do as a kid be into horror. Like horror was the genre I was really into. And I would steal my mom's books from her cabinet at like age 12. I was reading Stephen King like in my room. Like no one cared, but I was the weird kid with Stephen King books in like 6th and 7th grade. So yeah.
Yep, I get that. Like it's cool to be a nerdy now, which is really nice, but still weird when compared to childhood.
Yeah, for sure.
You mentioned that you were in theater. What did you do?
I was actually a lighting technician, so I'm not one to be in the spotlight at all. I had to take one acting class, and it was so painful. But I did a lot of off-Broadway theater and like event stuff in New York City. So I did that for a decade or more. And that's where a lot of my gaming friends that I play, or I'd say half the people I play with now are from. Yeah. So I did a lot of stagehand work.
Cool. Now I ask because I used to be a stage manager, so I always have to follow up that.
Yeah. And I had to take all the because I do have a BFA in theater, and so like I had to take like a writing and directing class, and I did have to do acting, which was painful, but like I got through it. But you did learn a lot of like creative stuff. And then I also had to do like drawing and drafting, which has helped me, I think, because now I can draw a map. It's not the best map in the world, but like I can draw a map and I can do it digitally, and that's helped me a lot in like the writing of these adventures, I think, as I had to tap back into all that creative stuff that I hadn't used in probably almost a decade.
Yeah, that's really cool. I hadn't thought about how that would relate, but those are some pretty good skills that could help with translating your vision onto paper.
Yeah.
So I would like to dig in a bit more to the process of, like, you wrote your one shot and then you found out that you could publish it. What were your next steps?
Oh, there were a lot. The very next step was writing a big ass to-do list. So I had to like figure out, I think the very next step was just like going through some of the legal stuff to know what was even possible. And then it was really a one shot that turned into a 3-session thing, because one shots are pretty hard to write, actually. So I stripped out a lot of the lore I wasn't allowed to use. Like a lot of the pantheons from D&D were in there. And so I had to take that all out. And then I just went through and replaced it with Grimm lore, which I actually ended up liking better. So the process for writing both of my adventures has been like, do some Grimm research, write down a lot of like cool items that show up in the stories so that there's still like interesting ties to the story and like Easter eggs from like the fairy tales hiding in the adventure, writing down like what the NPCs would be like and then like what the locations would be like, and then iterating on that a bunch, and just like, but the initial brain dump is really useful, and then iterating on that until you can like iron it out to like a good story. And then all throughout that, at some point you have to start doing the any illustrations, which I don't include a lot of illustrations because it would be a lot of time since I do everything. But the maps are important for running the game, and then like all the stat blocks and things. And so like it just becomes very iterative over like writing and then editing and like changing a few things here and there, and then doing the layout. And then like figuring out the whole process for the first adventure. Like I had to learn everything. I didn't know how to use a publishing layout program. I had forgotten most of how to do Photoshop. I had never done like vector drawing, which I find much better and easier for maps. And then I didn't know anything about DriveThruRPG until I signed up for an account. So all of that was like the first adventure. Everything was new. And I think I worked pretty steadily 30 hours a week from like Thanksgiving to like March to get out my first adventure. It was a lot.
So that was definitely a lot of different things that you needed to figure out for that first adventure. Is there anything that now that you've got several publications out, that you wish that you had realized before your first publication?
Probably so many things. I would say one thing I did do right is I started an Instagram and like an initial social media account immediately when I knew I was going to start doing this, almost immediately, so that I could at least, when it came out, like there were people already following me. It wasn't a lot, but there were some. I started Twitter later, which was a bummer because I get a fair amount of interaction on Twitter. So I think having social media is an important step, because like I know it's always a conversation on Twitter, but like marketing is very important, and I'm still not good at it. I wish I was better at it.
Before we dive too much further into kind of my more nitty-gritty questions that I love to ask, let's actually go back and talk about, what are your adventures about? We've mentioned Grimm, but what can you tell us about them?
Yeah, I've written 2. One is the first one was a little longer than the second one. My plan is to like build a universe, a little world. And the little world I've started with is just one kingdom. It's called the Kingdom of Grimsby. And that's where everything so far has taken place. There's mentions of other kingdoms, but I haven't expanded anything out to them yet. So the idea is I'm going to build out this kingdom and then maybe some neighboring kingdoms over time. And a lot of the NPCs are inspired by characters from Grimm's fairy tales. Grimm's fairy tales are usually pretty light on details. Like one story will be like 4 pages. So it's kind of nice because you can like take the characters mentioned there and like really expand on them. So I like to, take a few stories for each adventure and kind of mash them together. So the first story I ever wrote, I had mentioned the PCs would be 6 out of the 7 dwarves. And, they start their adventure because their friend disappears. And using fairy tales is kind of nice because people kind of know them already. And like, it helps drive the story a little bit. Like their friend goes missing. Everyone's immediately like, yeah, we know who that is. That's going to be Snow White. But like the characters don't really know that. So, she's hiding under a hidden identity. But like, then you can use fairy tales to your advantage because, the bad person in Snow White is the witch, but maybe she's just a misunderstood old lady. So like you can actually put twists in that like the players wouldn't expect based on the fairy tales too. So a lot of the 2 stories I've written are basically I will take some Grimm fairy tales and like smash them together. The second one I wrote was like the player characters are the animals from Bremen town musicians. So you actually get to play like a donkey or a cat or a hound or a rooster and then I added an owl and a raven just in case there were more than 4 people. And they come across a cabin, and that cabin is based on this cabin of, murderers and smugglers from like another Grimm story called The Robber Bridegroom, which is one of the more horror-based Grimm stories. So I really like taking the stories and kind of mushing them together a little bit and then spinning a little bit of horror on top of it.
They sound really fun.
Yeah, I really wanted to do the animal one. I started with the Snow White themed one, which was the first adventure, and I knew immediately that my second one was going to be let's play some animals because that sounds so much fun. I don't know. I really liked the way the second one came out with the animal characters, and when I play tested it, my group really had fun with it.
And then I know that you've got a lot of different subclasses published as well. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, those are all, I decided to like make my shop look a little bit bigger on DriveThruRPG. So the open gaming license for Wizards of the Coast is very limited on like what is available to use. So for each class, there's only like 1 or 2 subclasses you can even use legally. So like you can't pull in a death cleric for example, or you can't pull in an Oath of Vengeance paladin. So for my second adventure, I decided to write my own subclasses for the animal characters, and I themed them all in a very animal way. Like there's a Way of the Whiskers monk, there's a Beast Domain cleric, and then like one of the owl character, like his backstory has him rising from the ashes, so he's like a phoenix sorcerer. So I had to make them anyway for the adventures, so I decided that like I would just publish them as pay what you want so people could use them in their own adventures, because otherwise they're just hiding in this other adventure and no one's going to see it unless they buy that particular story. But I wanted people to be able to use those, for their own player characters, and they're all also available on D&D Beyond if people want to put them in their character sheets too.
Yeah, those names sound really cute.
I had a lot of fun writing these subclasses. I really enjoyed how they came out. And then I also had to make new backgrounds and even the races. I homebrewed all the animal stats so that they would be original and playable characters as well. So all the animal races are also available if people just want to use the animals for their campaign one day.
Okay, cool. So you mentioned earlier that for the first adventure, you started on it in November. You're spending about 30 hours a week until I think you said March. How long after you published that did it take you to get started working on your second adventure?
Oh, I swore to myself I was going to take a few months. And then I think it took me less than a month for me to pick up my Grimm's book again and start reading some stories, looking around for ideas. Because I already knew what that one wanted to be. I knew that one wanted to be the animal characters, but then I didn't know what the cabin in Bremen town musician, if you've ever read it, it's like a 3-page, 4-page fairy tale. It's not very in depth. So I wanted to find something for the bad guys, that was much better than what was in there. And so yeah, I think I only took a month break. And I was kind of like feeling like one story in my DriveThruRPG inventory it felt very insufficient. So I wanted to write something short, like, but thorough, and then have at least 2 adventures, and then plus all those like supplemental files as well in my inventory. Now I'm on like a longer break. I actually published Bremen in July, I think. And so the only thing I'm doing now is like fishing for a new print on demand company and like trying to organize everything in the background so that when I do publish again, it's some of that stuff is figured out.
Okay, that leads me into wanting to ask about those decisions. So I did notice when looking at your listings on DriveThruRPG that you do offer print on demand options in addition to the PDFs. What can you tell me about that decision?
I only offer, I think Snow White is print on demand. If I remember correctly, I haven't set up the Bremen one. I'm not in love with the print on demand options on DriveThruRPG, so I'm trying to see if there are better ones. I think for one shots, it's harder for people to like bite in and pay $20 for a one shot, even though it is like a 40-page book. So right now I'm kind of okay with Bremen just being a file. And I'd say most of my sales are just PDFs. But I do sell also print books of the Snow White adventure at a couple stores, like 2 game shops. I think the PDFs do better than the books right now, but I think that's because I'm also new.
Sure. How did you get the partnership set up to be able to sell them at the bookstores?
Well, the first books, I emailed all the bookstores that I knew about in New York, which is the good ones. There were like 4. Only one of them does local writers and indie writers regularly. So, and that was the one I had originally talked to the woman about, like writing the one shot that Christmas Eve. I was in her store. She loves working with local indie writers, and she writes RPGs herself. So it was, I think, a very easy match to go to 20-sided store and say, hey, I have this book. Are you interested in selling it? And so they were very good on like picking that up. And then the other one was I have friends in Vermont, and I was in Vermont for the summer, and I just randomly stopped by this really good game shop in Middlebury and like showed them the book, and like, so it's on sale at Tinker and Smithy as well in Middlebury, Vermont, if you're near any of those stores. Yeah, they were kind of just random. I mean, the one in Brooklyn was very planned, but the one in Middlebury was kind of, I'll just go try it and see what they say.
Yeah, that's really cool. So are they just stocking some of the print on demand from DriveThruRPG, or is there a different printer that they're getting it from? Like, how does that
I had
work?
a bunch of them printed myself and had them sent to me, so I just walked in and gave them copies. So they just have whatever I've printed. And yeah, they did come from DriveThruRPG, like that printer. And so I had like 20 copies sitting around and just handed them a small stack. And so at some point I will check in with them before Christmas to make sure they don't need more.
Okay, easy enough. So another thing that I am curious about is, especially since you've been mentioning how limited the open gaming license is about the decision to publish on DriveThruRPG in comparison to DM's Guild.
Yeah, I looked at both of those options. The Thanksgiving where I was like, I'm going to figure out if this is worth it. And I sat down and read a lot of the legal stuff and like watched a bunch of videos about the open gaming license because legal paperwork makes my head hurt. The thing about DM's Guild is you have to be in the Wizards of the Coast's 4 main universes. So you have to embed it in, what are they? Ravensloft, Faerun, Eberron, Greyhawk, maybe. And so that was like the whole purpose of me writing these, was to create my own universe. So I couldn't actually do DM's Guild. I am thinking about like the subclasses and things are very agnostic to the universe. So I probably could have put them on DM's Guild, but I decided to just dump them in with the rest of the stuff. So they were all in the same place. So DM's Guild is limited in that it's limited in a different way. You have to use their universe, but you have access to like everything in the Wizards of the Coast library, including graphics and things, it seems. But DriveThruRPG, you can create your own universe, but then you're limited as to what can go in. And I think the biggest limitations is like, I have to come up with some extra monsters, which I don't mind. And then the player, because I've been making player characters for the adventures so that like everything kind of matches and fits together, I've had to make extra like subclasses and backgrounds and things. But that's okay, because then it makes them kind of unique characters.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I know that it's interesting. Like there's more limitations in some ways. And then also DM's Guild takes a higher cut of sales. So I'm just always curious about the decision process that goes into that.
Yeah, and I think once you publish on DM's Guild, you can't use it anywhere else. I vaguely remember this being a thing I asked about. Mm-hmm. So like if I were to publish those subclasses on DM's Guild, I actually can't use them in my story anymore, even though I've written them. This is what I heard hearsay, which it kind of just tipped the scales, and I didn't actually verify what the person, it was someone from DriveThruRPG that told me this. So yeah, so it can be, I think they own it in some way, but I'm not 100% sure on that. No one should quote me on that.
I guess I didn't necessarily realize that you couldn't use it in another publication that was also on DM's Guild.
Oh, you might be able to use it on DM's Guild, but I don't think you can. Maybe you can't use it in DriveThruRPG.
Anywhere else. Yeah. Yeah, we've got a few things that Brenton published on DM's Guild and then we learned those rules and we're like, oh, whoops.
Oh, yeah. I'm so scared of being sued that I just am overly cautious about everything. I mean, you'll notice it if you ever download any of my adventures. It has the 2-page legal appendix in the back. I was super thorough about that. I was like, I am not getting sued or shut down by Wizards of the Coast, so I will do whatever it takes not to.
Hey entrepreneurs, I love introducing you to new creators every episode, but I could really use your support. I would love to invite you to join our Patreon page, where you'll gain access to behind-the-scenes content, add your questions to upcoming interviews, and you could even receive a shout-out on our site in an upcoming episode. To learn more, go to lightheartadventures.com/RPG. And now, back to the show. You chatted a bit about having to learn how to do the maps and getting the artwork into your PDFs and figuring out layout. And so, yeah, I guess just I'm curious on what your process was, or kind of just a bit about your journey about learning the more artistic side of it and getting that ready for publication.
Yeah, that was rough. I had used Photoshop and drafting programs in the past, but it had been so long. So I didn't go with the Photoshop suite because it's a monthly subscription and that just wasn't in my budget. And I didn't know how long I was going to be doing this, or, at the beginning, you never know. So I bought into the Affinity suite, and I just immediately went online to do a few tutorials. Book layout was totally new to me, but it's not super complicated. It's no more complicated than Photoshop or vector drawing. And I think it's the easiest of the three things to do. There was definitely a refresher for me, and I'm not super good at illustrating. I'm decent at textures and making things look like something, but I'm never going to be a good character drawer, or I'm never going to be the best map maker, but I can make maps that make sense and kind of make them pretty. So I think a lot of it was just looking at what other people do and trying to just say, oh, I like this particular type of detail or this style or this color palette in this person's artwork, and then just bringing that back to whatever I'm working on. So the colors were all inspired by this one illustrator from the 1800s or something. I would just look at a lot of his pictures and the way he drew his lines and shapes and things, and I just incorporated that. I can't remember his name though. I think that the hardest part for me was just to get started. And so I've learned the empty canvas is the worst thing in the world. So now I've just learned to just start putting things on it and then iterating over that.
Real quick, for the non-artists in the audience, what is a vector drawing and why do you prefer that for the maps?
Oh yeah. So you can do pixel drawings or vector drawings are the two types of things. So Photoshop does photo editing for the most part. And then if you use something it's the difference between drawing where you're filling in pixels versus drawing by drawing lines and shapes. So the way that the program remembers Photoshop stuff is typically by pixel maps. So you just have a layout of pixels. You're really just in the background, you are just filling in pixels with color. On like vector drawing, it remembers the shapes and the lines as shapes and lines instead of like a line is like a bunch of pixels filled in. And so for maps, I tend to do the vector drawing because it's a lot more like lines and shapes and like, okay, now I'm going to put some streets on this village map, and then I'm going to put some like little houses on here. And to me, that's just like easier to do in that kind of program instead of photo editing. Now, a lot of the like textures that I use, I'll do it in a photo editing program and then import them into the vector drawings instead.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I just wanted to make sure that was out there because I know that was a term that I only recently learned. Yeah. What about layout? What are some things that you've learned about making a good layout for these, for both the adventures and for the subclasses?
I don't know if I do it well. I really wanted my books to look like old storybooks or old fairy tales without going really overboard. And I wanted them to look old. So all of my pages I made look like they're kind of old and like a little damaged and a little moldy. And so, but really that is just like creating a picture and throwing it in the background of your page. Because I don't include a lot of illustrations, my layouts aren't super exciting, but the more I worked on laying out the books, the more I realized like, oh, this little box over here I have to actually make a picture for that. And so like all the stat blocks I decided to include and all of the, like occasionally I'll include an illustration of like a flyer that the characters would find in lieu of putting in character drawings and illustrations. So it did end up being more work than I was ready for. But I think now that I've done it a couple times, it's actually not too bad. And I've learned if the best advice is do not write in a layout program. Just don't do it. You should write in something that has a really good grammar check and a really good spell check and will back your stuff somewhere that's not on a local computer. I mean, I just use Google Drive. It's free. And then when you're pretty close to being done, that's when you just import it into the layout, because layout programs are very finicky and you have to move stuff around a lot. I find you have to do this. And so if you're constantly editing and adding stuff, like you're just like adding in pages constantly and taking away pages. It's not like, at least the one I use, it's not like Word where it will like figure stuff out. It's like you almost have to tell it to do everything. So it's best to like, I do a lot of my editing just in a Google Doc. I mean, I start by doing an outline in Google Doc, and then from there, that outline turns into the actual adventure. And then I just import it in. And I know where in the Google Doc where I want all the pictures, because I'll put it in bright red, like put this picture here. And so as I start making those pictures, then I'll throw them into the publisher program that I use. As far as like how I organize the adventure, I find that really important, especially if it's going to be detailed. I mean, some people's one-shots are like only a few pages, and so that's not too bad. But like I tend to write a lot of details so that a new DM can pick it up, read it, and be like, I have all these things. I can just start this adventure tomorrow. So I found like organizing the story is really important. And for the first adventure, I like played around with a few ways to organize it, but I just find that like having chapters of the locations and like encounters, and then having indices in the back where it's like, or appendices where, you just have all the NPCs like backstories. I don't want the NPCs to be lame or like not thought out. I mean, some of them, they don't all need to be complex, but like a lot of them were. And so I wanted to make sure it was easy to reference each NPC. So I didn't want to embed that information into like the rest of the adventure, I guess. I've seen like a few RPG books that are very confusing because everything's like intertwined. So I wanted to make everything like pretty easily referenceable. There's also index. Everyone should have an index. It's a secret, but everyone should have one. So I made sure it was just organized in a way that when you're running it, it's easy to find stuff, I think, is the short answer for that.
I really appreciate that because, yeah, I agree. Like, especially even the Wizards of the Coast adventures, I'm DMing one right now, and it's so hard to follow the plot.
Ooh, which one are
a
you?
lot of the time.
Which one are you doing?
Curse of Strahd.
Oh, I played in that one. It was a fantastic story.
Yeah.
That was the second campaign I ever was in as a player. I actually really like it, but I don't know what the book looks like. I'm trying to prep Out of the Abyss to start with my friends next year, and yeah, I've had to basically untangle a lot of stuff, and I'm like, I will never write a chapter like this.
Yeah, like I love the story too, but honestly, the only way I'm able to get through it is because I found this amazing Reddit thread, and the Reddit community there is really cool and just helping you actually flesh out all of the chapters. Because what I realize is a pet peeve now is you'll be reading the room descriptions, because everything is divided by room descriptions, not here's the story. And so you'll read a sentence that is a reference to some character that hasn't been mentioned before. And then 80 pages later, that character pops up again as like a response to that sentence you read 80 pages before.
Yeah, they do that in Out of the Abyss as well. I wonder if they've gotten any better, because I think Out of the Abyss and Curse of Strahd are relatively old in the 5e. But Out of the Abyss, they have a whole chapter where I'm like, I don't even know if I understood all the like events. So I had to like map it out on paper. But there's also as well, like a lot of people have written stuff on DM's Guild to help. So yeah, I think my friend who DM'd Curse of Strahd also used a lot of stuff and references from Reddit as well. It's tough.
Yeah, it's great that there's a community that can help you, but it's also like just put the story and then you can talk about the rooms.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think I did this better in my second adventure, just because I had learned a little bit, is like I made sure the location information was in its own block of text, and then anything about encounters that would happen in that location would be in a different heading. You know what I mean? Like I try to, and I think this comes from being a data engineer, actually, where I think in like database logic, where you really want to separate everything. And that's how I think about world building as well. Like the location is the location, and then stuff happens in the location. So like I like to keep those threads of information still kind of separate, but near each other. And then the people that wander in and out of locations and in the adventure, like they're also a separate entity. And so I very much think of all the pieces of the world as like different entities. There's locations, there's quests, there's the NPCs, and then there's like clues to be found, which could be location specific. So I try and like make sure that the information for the DM is like clearly blocked out and clean, I guess.
As a DM, I appreciate that.
Yes.
But to circle back, you started going more into the process of, you've got your Google Docs and then you're inserting like in red text, like where you're going to put pictures, and you're starting to detail that process. And as someone who is kind of a little too obsessed with processes, I want to know, like, okay, so you've got your draft in Google Docs, and then like, what exactly are the steps that you're taking to get everything ready?
Yeah. Writing an adventure is not super linear.
Yeah.
There's the initial research of my research is like reading Grimm's fairy tales. So I just read them before bed. And then brain dumping into a Google Doc. And that should just be quick, dirty, get things down, like write down cool items that are mentioned in the story that you're using, cool NPCs that, would crop up. And then, the locations that you think would be useful, and then like the quests that would be useful or interesting for people to do, or quests and encounters. And so the initial brain dump into Google Drive is like the first thing I've started with. From that, I don't think in that process I ever write a full sentence. It's almost definitely, or it's like certainly no full paragraphs. It is just like notes and thoughts. And then after that, like maybe sketching out some of the locations on paper, just so like I make sure that if I'm going to draw a castle and start like laying out the rooms, I want to make sure it makes sense on paper. I mean, floor plans are kind of nice for me because I did take 1 year of architecture before I went into theater. So I actually really like doing floor plans. So I think sketching and then going around again and like going through your notes and then start writing like the descriptions of the locations, the like cool items they would find. And then like, but knowing like the quests and or the encounters and the things, you know, you think would be interesting for the players to do, then dictates like, what kind of clues can they find? Like, oh, well, if they search this thing, they'll get a flyer that hints at, you know, something, or like hints at the fact that the bad guys will be back later tonight because they're probably at this thing that there's a flyer for. Or, you know, like if these creepy people at the cabin like are smugglers, like maybe you find their ledger with all their like stuff. So like clues as to who owns the location or who lives in the location are interesting. And like I also just like building that out because then it makes everything 3-dimensional and less flat. But I think iterating over and over again on like, once you have that initial outline is just like what eventually like becomes the story for me, because I write my stories very much in a like referenceable set of chapters and appendices. Like the outline almost just becomes the adventure once you just fill it in with full sentences. And I'd say like it's probably a handful of iterations. And then as you're going through that, I make notes in bright red, like, ooh, this would be interesting. Make sure I remember to write this idea out. So like, I do have a personality where I don't want to forget anything. So like, I will always write notes as I think of them, but like try not to get distracted if I'm in the middle of something else. So I can keep going with what I'm doing, but I'm like, oh yeah, this character's, you know, has this kind of personality. They would probably have this magical item for the players to find, but I don't want to like sidetrack and make that magical item now. So I just like dump it somewhere else in the file. So the initial document is very much like a growing document that just becomes the adventure. Throughout that, noting like what supplemental things do you need? Like what photos do you need? Those usually come towards the end because I don't want to spend a lot of time redoing photos and maps. But the maps are almost always hand-drawn or sort of sketched out before I even open a computer. Otherwise, I'm lost with a blank canvas. Yeah, I don't know. That tends to be it, I think. And then also actually there's stuff that I do after I publish too. So the tools I use to do photo editing, I use the full Affinity suite, which I think a lot of people do use. It has a photo editor as vector drawing, and it has the publisher, and they work very well together. And you can buy them as a bundle typically for slightly cheaper than buying them individually. And it's not like Photoshop where you have to spend money every month. It's like you buy them once and then you're good to go. And then afterwards, once my book is published, I haven't done this for my last adventure, but it's on my to-do list for the weekend, is I will put information about the NPCs and like the timeline of events I use Kanka as my world building app for personal use and for work use. And so if I ever want to like reuse an NPC because I'm still in the same universe and I want someone to make an old NPC from another story or to make a cameo in like this one in a newer adventure, like I have it all in one place and I have everyone's like timelines in there. And so I do that at the end of the adventure as well, just to keep track of things.
That's cool. I'm not familiar with Kanka. Is that what you said?
Yeah, Kanka. It's like a lot of people use World Anvil as well for world building, but Kanka's a little simpler, and I think it was just easier for me to pick up. And it's like a place where you can. This might be useful as a DM to know too. It does take time if you're going to use it for a campaign, but like you can create all your entities there, so you can have, you know, you have like all your characters in there, and then you can do like linking between things. So there's a lot of references. So if you're building out like a dungeon or like one location, you can have, you know, the location information, and then you can say, well, like character so-and-so is in this location, and you can have like a direct link to that character page just in the location page. So you can do a lot of cross-referencing. It's really useful for world building, and I highly recommend Kanka. They're not paying me to say that. They don't even know who I am.
That's cool. I'll check them out.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I do want to make sure that we devote some time to asking a question that I like to ask in every interview. And since you mentioned you listened to a couple episodes, hopefully you know this is coming. But when you look back over the last, I guess, couple of years now, since you decided to make a publication out of the one shot that you had developed, what would you say has been the most challenging part?
I think the most challenging part, I did know this was coming. I think the most challenging part is doing everything. It's, I feel like if I had the money to pay someone to help me, it would be great, but I don't. So I have to do everything. I think the most challenging part was to like learn everything, including just like, you're doing everything. You're doing the marketing. Well, I'm doing the marketing, and I'm doing the writing, and I'm doing the layout stuff, and I'm doing all the photo editing, and I'm doing the map making, and then on top of a full-time job. So it's very much like, thankfully I'm really organized as a person. So like, making sure I keep on task, and so there are no like surprises at the end. But I think doing everything is a bit of a challenge. I look forward to the days where I can partner with people, afford to partner with people, because I don't really believe in like making someone work for very little money. And like, I can't even offer profit because I don't profit that much yet. So yeah, so I'm looking forward to the day where it might be a bigger thing than just me. But for now it is just me. And so it's a lot, but I like doing it, and I think that's the biggest challenge.
Yeah, that makes sense. There is a lot more that goes into this than just writing the story, which even that is a lot, but I get it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I hope that you get to the point soon where you are able to start partnering with some people.
Yeah, I definitely have been noting, like, oh, I love these people's maps. And so it's a lot of it is like fishing around on Twitter and seeing like who's out there and like who's, who sounds like they work with people for like future, but like it's going to be a while. And like there's some illustrators out there where I'm like, oh my God, I would love your stuff in my books, but I can't afford you. So, right now it's just a dream, but maybe one day I'll do a Kickstarter and like actually be able to pay people.
Oh my gosh, I'm now imagining like a Grimm's themed campaign book of like, even if it was just a compilation of all the 1 or 3 shot stories that you've done, that'd be super cool.
Yeah, I am hoping like after I have a slight idea of what I want to do for the next one. And I'm wondering like maybe after I've done 3, if I just like, bind them together and like create like a really nice version of all 3 of them put together, might be a thing I will think about doing. And then, paying an illustrator to put cool pictures in it, and, revamping some of the artwork that, was just me. Yeah, it's definitely an idea. I want to get at least one more story under my belt, which I've got the ideas. I think in November I'll start getting the book out and reading some stories and taking some notes and formulating an adventure again.
Well, I do want to be able to flip this around and ask, what about the most rewarding part? What have you really enjoyed about the last couple of years?
I was surprised at how big the Twitter community is and how supportive they are. So like meeting people there in that space has been nice. I've never done podcast interview before. So, it's like, now I've done 2. This is so weird. These are things I just never thought I would ever do. And I mean, I really love creating the world. I think the world building is my absolute favorite part. Like, I just really like creating the, there's a castle, but then there's these creepy people inhabiting it, or like, I love creating the locations, the backstories for the characters I include. It's just, I really like taking something and making it very 3-dimensional. So I think that's my absolute favorite part. But then I've met a lot more people, doing RPGs just because I publish, and I don't think I would have been that involved in that community had I not published or written anything. So that's also been really rewarding.
The connections in this community are so awesome.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you were able to find that.
Yeah. I mean, there's always a few lurkers around there that you're like, I don't know about you.
True.
But that comes with every community, right? So, but there have definitely been some nice connections out there.
Cool. Well, I know you said that you're on a break and it'll probably be November before you're picking back up. Is there anything that's in the works, or is it just you'll start back up in November?
I think I'm going to start back in November. It was really like from last November to July where I worked steadily, except for a very, very, very short break in between. And so I think I needed some time to just decompress and organize a lot of the stuff, like, how to keep track of things for sales and like how to just make sure all my notes, like I had all these notes from learning how to do all the programs that I've just been writing on pieces of paper, but I'm like, that's going to be useful for me I need to know that all the time. So like I might digitize some of my notes and like, just like stuff that will help me in the future. I would just like to take the next couple months to just like slowly figure some of that stuff out and then go back to creative writing. And I have more time off because of the holidays. So November and December are much easier for me to like build a bunch of momentum. Whereas like if I start now, it'll be a lot harder because I have a lot of work. So I'm definitely like have committed to beginning to write something new in November once I have some more time off.
Cool. Well, I look forward to seeing what that next project is.
Yeah, me too.
Well, Krista, thanks so much for coming on today. Where can people find you?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Cattail Press. Tail with like fairy tale, not tail like cat, an actual cattail. So Cattail Press on Instagram and Twitter. And then you can also email me at cattailpress@gmail.com. And then I do have a website, cattailpress.com, and on DriveThruRPG is where all of my PDFs are listed, and you can buy the first adventure print on demand. And then if you want buy my books in person, which people still do, they're on sale at 20-Sided Store in Brooklyn or Tinker and Smithy in Middlebury.
Awesome. I will include links to all of those in the show notes.
Perfect. Well, thank you for having me on your podcast. This was great.
Yeah, I really enjoyed getting to learn more about you and your stories, and I am very excited to try out some Grimm's-themed adventures.
Yeah, fantastic.
You just finished another episode of Roll, Play, Grow. To check out the show notes from today's episode, you can go to lightheartadventures.com/RPG. To keep up with every episode, please subscribe on your podcast player of choice. And if you're enjoying the show, I would absolutely love if you would leave me a review and share this episode with your friends. Your review might even get featured on an upcoming episode. To follow me on Twitter, you can either find me at lightheartadv for our business account, or at KetraWCR for tweets on gaming, my dog Bowser, and other random shenanigans. You can also find us as Lightheart Adventures on both Instagram and Patreon. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time on Roll, Play, Grow.